Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and we'll get started now on our breakout discussion. Again, I'm Brian Waddingham with the Coalition. If you have any questions for us or need more information, I'll be in this room throughout the breakout session. But I do want to introduce Kelli Carolyn with the Iowa Cattlemen's Association. She's going to be the moderator for today. If you have any questions, make sure you raise your hand. She'll get around to you. But with that, I'll turn it over to Kelli.
Thanks much, Brian. Appreciate being here today. Today we've got with us, we're in the cattle breakout session, so if you're not here for the cattle breakout session, you may want to check your agenda. But as you met earlier, we've got Brian Feldpausch from Grundy County, cattle feeder, feedlot and row crop, as well as Kelli with Big Gain Feeds, one of the consulting partners that works with Brian and many other producers around the state. So I guess to start off our discussion this afternoon in our breakout session, we're just going to have the two presenters here give a little more background about their operation. And as soon as we get through that, we'll go ahead and start taking questions. I would ask as we take questions, I'll have one of the portable mics. Raise your hand and we'll get around to you so that we can make sure everybody can hear your questions. So with that, I think, Brian, are you up first?
Well, good afternoon. My name is Brian Feldpausch, and as Kelli said, I live in Grundy County by Beeman. I farm with my father-in-law and his brother, and my wife and kids. We're the sixth generation on the family farm, so there's a lot of history there. And you know, I don't know what some of your situations would be like, but ours is not just multi-generational, but it's multi-family. So it always adds to some of the discussions and some of the plans for the future of things we're doing. I guess I mentioned earlier, I attended the first coalition meeting back in, I think it was the first meeting, I think it was in '05 in the Amanas. We were looking at coming back, joining the farm operation. See if that works. Yeah. So this is kind of the original part of the farm operation that we started with. We were feeding in outside lots, 4 different lots. Have always worked well for us. But when we wanted to come back and expand the farming operation, you know, trying to add capacity, probably on the livestock side made the most sense. And back then, there wasn't a lot of talk of monoslopes and hoop barns were basically the two mainly talked about options at that time. There's the feeding inside. So in '05, we went around like, you know, most producers do when they start investigating, and went around and looked at a few of the different folks with hoop barns at that time. There really weren't all that many around, even at that point. And we came up with doing two 160 by 50 hoop barns with the eaves on them. The way our design is to meet the requirements. We wanted to stay an open feedlot, so we put the area in the middle where the waterers were, because that just fit our situation at that time a lot better. When we were making the decision on what to do then, and I think as a lot of you face it now, is we looked at all the resources we had, and at that time, with myself coming back to the farm, and my father-in-law and his brother, we seemed to have a lot of extra labor. So adding, you know, a deep bedded barns seemed to be a good route to take on the livestock side. As time has went on, and as we were talking about at lunchtime, you know, at some point those open lots are probably going to need to be replaced for one reason or another. And when we do that, you know, we'll probably be looking at an alternative, and we might be looking at, you know, the deep pitted barns, because at that time, then labor's not going to be necessarily the most relevant or most excess resource that we've got. And I guess that was one of the things I just wanted to point out before we got going, is I guess I'd encourage everybody to look at all your resources. You know, if you're a young guy starting out, labor might be your best friend. But if you're in a family operation, or, you know, you've been established maybe in the crop situation for a while, and, you know, you've enjoyed the good times for the last few years, you might have some cash at your disposal. And I think, you know, looking at all of those, it's going to be a lot easier for us in the future to look at building a monoslope barn, because we're going to be able to leverage some of the lots we have to bring down those fixed costs. Because as I mentioned before, you know, and Dr. Cole did, when the cycle comes around again, The lower cost, most efficient, effective producer is probably going to be in the best position. So I guess that would be one point I wanted to make before we got going. The second one is, I'll leave this slides up there, but there's some Holsteins in there. Our family has raised market heifers for 35 years probably. It's always been market heifers. That's always what it was. A few years ago when prices kind of got a little out of hand, that's when we were working with Big Gain, and they've got a Holstein program, and so we put a few Holsteins in then, and they worked all right, but then the colored cattle market became a little more feasible again, so of course we went back to colored cattle. Well, here in the last couple of years, if you're trying to source cattle, or especially the last summer, if you're trying to source cattle and put black ink in the projections, you might have to look at alternatives, and so we're back with Holsteins again. Through their program that we're doing, but that's one of the things. We own all of our cattle, so as those options come about, that's one of the challenges too of sourcing cattle. And if you can get into a custom situation, that's a different story, but that's also kind of tough to do. Talked about the different lots we had. I guess I don't know. I don't know what else I should say to start with. I think we'll have time for questions in a little bit. But I guess the two things I'd encourage you to do is when you're looking at what your plans are for the future, just as someone who's went through it and going to go through it again, is look at the resources you have, all of them, not just labor and equipment and that, but look at the financial resources and maybe partnering up with neighbors and things like that. Look at that and look at where the cattle are going to come from, and look at what you're going to feed and how you're going to handle all the materials after doing that, because all that goes together. And the last one kind of goes without saying, but also you're going to have to take a long, hard look at where you think this environmental movement's going to go in the next 2 to 10 to 15 years, because I think that's going to have a big impact as well, because depending on what your belief is in that situation, that'll probably guide some of the decisions too. So. I guess that last slide, I didn't realize was there. I don't know if I can get back to it. There it is. I guess this is another question that we often get too, is what do you feed? And you'll probably ask Kelly, what does she tell people to feed? Well, the answer is whatever you have. What's most prevalent. And we feed high moisture corn mostly, some dry corn. We've been feeding earlage for about 30 years. So I don't know how they got started on it, but we've just been doing it for a long time, and it's caught on here in the last few years. But it's really good feed, and then we add modified distillers, and then of course our supplements that we get through Big Gain. So that's kind of our situation where we're at in Central Iowa.
Okay, we'll get started here. So this was what I put up earlier today, do sweat the small stuff, and it's something that I really, really believe. And one of the things that the foundation of Big Gain is records. Understand your economics and understand how those records can help you make decisions for the future. And so, what are the economic drivers of your feed yard? What is the most important one? And where should you be, spending or putting your attention on? How's bunk management play into that? How's pen management, yardage calculations? We hear all this talk about buildings, slatted confinement buildings or deep bedded buildings. Have you ever sat down and run occupancy rates? What does it mean if you have 80% occupancy versus 90% occupancy of that building? What does that mean for your yardage? And so those are things that I really think you need to fully understand to be meticulous and to sweat that small stuff to put the most money in your pocket. I have a whole set of slides here, and I'm going to try to flip through really fast. But if you ask a question later and there's something we want to bring back up, feel free. So obviously the economic drivers of your feed yard that are important, your corn costs, your daily gain, purchase price of the cattle, selling price of the cattle, all of these are obviously what drives your profitability. All of you got this projection. You can't really see it up here, but it's a group of cattle that went in a week and a half ago. 622-pound heifers at 211.96, I think it was. So this is what the projection would be if someone called up and asked on these cattle. So from this, or today, starting with nothing, how do you determine what's important for the economic drivers of your feed yard? One of the ways that I've kind of come up with, and one of the other gentlemen that work for Big Gain, we kind of look at it as where should we focus our attention? Obviously, everyone in this room has probably heard the money's made the day you buy and the day you sell the cattle, right? We've all heard that old adage. However, I really feel like there are things we can do along the way to change where that red versus black line is. And so what I did was I took that projection, put it into this spreadsheet, put the projected value for all of these economic drivers: purchase price, selling price, feed conversion, corn cost, all of those different economic drivers. And then I changed it 10% better or 10% worse. And what does that value attribute to your bottom line? And everyone here has heard, well, I had this group of cattle go out and they gained 4 pounds a day. And I'm going to be the first to say, congratulations, but what did they convert? Because when you look at this spreadsheet, what's your number 3 economic driver behind buying and selling? It's your dry matter feed conversion. And there are a lot of ways, without buying a single thing from me or anybody else, that you in this room can change your dry matter feed conversion to make yourself more money. It takes a team. It takes people to help you. That's why I have the tools that I have as a nutritionist. But I honestly believe there's a lot of feed yards we walk on, and a year later, they're a half a pound better feed conversion. And I can't tell you what that means to their bottom line. So basically, this spreadsheet is just kind of putting it to your attention that these are some of the things that you need to really look at. Obviously, corn price is important. It's number 4. Can we do a lot to change our corn price? Can we do a lot to change our selling and buying price? Not a lot. There are things we can do, niche marketing, different things. But in the end, there's not a ton we can do. We can do a lot to change our feed conversion. So I say, why does it matter? If you just look at this, 1/10 of a pound of feed conversion, if you're putting on 650 pounds of gain, the average price per pound of dry matter at around $3.90 corn is going to be 7.5 cents. That's $4.88 per head, more that you gain just by changing your feed conversion 1/10 of a pound. On a 2,000 head feed yard, you made yourself $10,000 more that year. Now you change it 1/2 a pound, you're at $50,000 a year. It's obviously, it might not be, 1/10 of a pound might not be make or break in your situation, but when you start looking at where cattle cost today and where the break-evens are, sometimes that's the difference between red and black. Cattle Facts reports the average profit in feeding cattle over the past 25 years is $27. If you improve your feed conversion by 1/2 a pound, you double your profits. One of the things that we get questions on is $35 difference in supplement cost, or putting Tylen in the feed. To put Tylen in the feed for liver abscesses, this is just another example of economic drivers, around $35 a ton. And everyone thinks, oh my goodness, $35 a ton. When you actually understand your economics and you put it into equation, $35 a ton supplement cost difference is going to be $4.14 per head difference over 650 pounds of gain. When you do all the math, if the Tylen improves your feed to gain by 0.085, you're going to pay for that $35 a ton difference. And it's labeled for well over that. So I'm not trying to be an Elanco salesman. I'm using this as an example to show to you that understanding your economics, this is just an example of understanding your economics, you're going to go at $35 a ton because you understand that we'll easily make that up. Bunk management. I tell people this all the time. You could consistently do it wrong and do it better than doing it inconsistently. I 100% believe that. I beat that into my husband's head all the time. If you are a 1/2 a pound ahead or a 1/2 a pound behind on dry matter delivery to the bunk, but you're consistent at it, you're going to be well ahead than when you are a pound ahead today, a pound behind tomorrow, a pound ahead today, a pound behind tomorrow. That's one of the fundamentals of where Big Gain comes from, is helping you with your bunk management, helping you with your intake strategies. I'm going to skip over a lot of this because I don't want to take up too much time, but I did include a predicted intake sheet that I passed out. That's something that we do for our customers on incoming cattle. It actually goes all the way through the feeding period. How that's derived is, I told you we had feedlot accounting. We actually take a database of the closeouts. So when you call up and say, like this, for instance, 622-pound heifers, the intake curve and the intakes on that sheet are based on intake curves from previous groups of cattle. So it's not me in my ivory tower making this up, telling you this is what they should eat. This is real, true intake data. And so this can help you make that curve. This is what we want. This can help you make that curve, look like that. And, 27 pounds of dry matter intake 2 weeks in is probably not where you want to be. It's probably going to make you be at 20 pounds out here on day 140. We don't need to see that up, down. We don't need to see that falling off. If we're consistent at it and we can follow this curve, more money in your pocket. Just 2 quick examples. I call this smooth curve. This is what our tracking report, one of the pages of our tracking report looks like. A group of cattle came in. This is reported from the farmer. Every good cattle presentation has to have a poop slide. So that's it from their pen, from that pen. Here's what I call more of the roller coaster. More went too far ahead, came down, went too far ahead, came down, went too far ahead, came down. This is very common. I see it all the time. Another poop slide. Comparison. So smooth curve, finished weight was 1376. They did a 352, converted at a 569. Roller coaster finished at 1288, 312 with a 672 feed conversion. So if you compare that, there was a 1.03 feed to gain difference at 7 cents per pound of dry matter. The smooth curve made $50.21 more a head, strictly on feed conversion. Everything else was the same. Pen management, this is something we can talk about later if you want to. Rubber slats, bedding, not making it an event. Yardage calculator, we have a yardage calculator. If I ever want to get into a really in-depth conversation with any of you, I'll sit down and pull this out because 2 hours later we'll probably walk away both scratching our head. It's understanding really how much is that tractor allocated to the feed yard versus the cropping enterprise, what's amortized, what's not, all of those things. If you've really never sat down and figured out what your yardage is, that's one way to really understand your economics. I have a bunch of slides on corn processing. As a company, we look at manure starch a lot. We look at how corn is processed and how that leads to feed conversion. And mainly because the guy that hired me to come work with Big Gain, or one of the guys that hired me, worked at a feed yard in Delhart, Texas. And down there, if their feed conversion changed 1/10 of a pound, they fired their nutritionist. And at the time he was there, most people in the upper Midwest had no idea what their feed conversion was. And so they were constantly looking at manure starch. And, steam flaked yards are constantly monitoring it, and it's somewhere between 5 to 7%. Highly processed high moisture corn, we can get some of our feed yards down in that 7%. When they're using it right, the rations are tuned in, and all that leads back to better feed conversion, more money in your pocket. I have some slides on some trials we did on that. If anybody has a question, we can talk about that later. Feedstuff Shrink, the understanding if you have that pile of hay sitting out and it gets 2 inches of rain on it, and you go to scoop it up and put it in the bunk, all of a sudden you fed half of the amount of hay that your ration calls for, and understanding what that does to your dry matter feed conversion. Using records to understand exactly what your shrink is. How much distillers did you buy? How much did you actually feed? Those are things to look at your bottom line. And I truly, truly believe this. Whether you have 50 head or 5,000 head or 50,000 head is absolutely the small stuff that leads to the better bottom line. And, of all the closeouts I see, and I get to see all of our trade area, South Dakota, all those, the most meticulous managers are the ones, whether it is a 50 head feed yard or 5,000 head feed yard, profit per head are the most meticulous managers. So. Probably better not forget this, I'll get fired. how can we help? Obviously, we have rations, projections, yardage calculator. We do have a veterinarian that we pay retainer to, so if you have incoming problems, cost, I've had him out to look at feed on some feed yards before. We do source cattle, and currently we have a Holstein marketing agreement with a packer, and we do forward pricing on Holsteins. Working on a colored cattle agreement. We've had some test loads go. Millers have actually sent some test loads. We're working on that. So records. We have the ability to keep track of every penny you spend. So we can do that and help you make the decisions from there. So.
Okay. Questions for Brian and Kelly? Oh, yeah.
Do you do much with the commercial cow herd? So if you buy our cattle, for example, and we're doing 205-day waits, is there anything that you're doing to tie back to where those cattle originate?
We work on both the cow-calf and the feedlot side, and so a lot of times what I get into more is helping the feedlot buy directly from the cow-calf guy and trying to come up with a fair price, and sometimes that puts me in a hard situation. I told Brian today at lunch, my husband and I have 100 cows. This is the first time in 9 years that I haven't sold my calves to one of my customers, because when I ran the numbers this year, I couldn't get it to work, and in my head I'm thinking, as a nutritionist, I can't say, yes, do this. And so, but yeah, as far as that's concerned, we do the nutrition on the cow-calf side and on the feedlot side, and a lot of times where we get involved in that is kind of bridging the two. And we have a company-wide, so our territories, upper Midwest, we have a needs-wants list. So if somebody has some cattle for sale, what we do is we put them out there, and then the nutritionist in Southwest Minnesota, Northwest Iowa, myself, all over, then they can go ahead and represent those to their customers.
Brian, I understand you own a lot of your own cattle. We are hearing a lot more about risk management. A lot of the young people here are going to be involved in that. What are you doing for risk management on your cattle, on the buying and selling and input cost?
As far as the risk management, not a lot. We've just this year, with all the volatility in the market, we're finally going to start putting some hedges on some of the cattle that we are putting on some of the cattle we're feeding. On the other side of it, we have fed some Holsteins or through the Big Gain program, and those with that marketing agreement, it makes it a lot easier to lock in a price. If in my case, just starting out, in my father-in-law's case, doing it 40 years and never having a hedge account before, so it was a lot easier just to set a price with them that way. So I'll be in trouble with one demographic or another. So I was just happy with Dr. Cole. I could stand up because for a few more months yet, I was under the 42-year-old threshold. And then on the feedstuff side, I guess the biggest thing we've locked in some of our distillers over time. And then I guess as far as the cost control, it's just, being willing to manipulate the price on the corn that we produce, to make it a comfort level, especially when we had $6 corn, but we really haven't done. I mean, that's probably one of our weakest areas. Well, we've got a lot, but that's probably the weakest area we've been at is risk protection, I guess, to be honest.
Kelly was going to talk about not making bedding an event. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I get questions all the time when I go to feed yards. I go out there in bed, and then my cattle eat half of it, and then the next day there's a bunch of feed left in the bunk. And sometimes I can say this, and sometimes I can't to them, but most of the time that's the situation where they haven't bedded enough all along, and all of a sudden it's an event in those cattle's life. Whether it's really cumbersome to do, and they have to run them out of the pen or disrupt their daily activities, or they're just really, really uncomfortable, and all of a sudden you go dump 8 bales in a pen at one time. It's something new and crazy, and so it becomes an event. And my feed yards that kind of consistently just bed the cattle, twice a week or sometimes 3 times a week, depending on the size of the cattle, consistent light layer bedding, those are the feed yards that don't see that dry matter intake drop after they bed. And really, all we're trying to do is prevent that animal from filling up on a bunch of corn stalks today, being hungry, and then tomorrow go into the bunk and gorging themselves on, a ration. And every time you cause an acidotic or a drop in the pH in that stomach when they overeat, you're just further, taking away from that dry matter feed conversion and more money out of your pocket. So.
If you've got a question, just put your hand in there.
Just-
We'll get a mic over
I was
to
just
you.
going to, something to add to that for Keith's question. On betting, one thing, we were kind of in that event betting stage at one time. And, the first step we took, we bought a betting processor when we put up the hoops. And I was just talking to somebody about it earlier today. We just never could make it work. It was almost slower than betting by hand, or betting with bales individually. But what we've done in those hoop barns is we've betted about once a week, twice a week sometimes, depending on the conditions. And by doing that, those cattle come in, they destroy those bales almost immediately, and it's down to bedding, and it's never really a problem with consumption then after that. But that's the key. Just getting it more often.
What's your rule, what you're looking for the bunk management? When do you step up on feed?
So obviously the first 30 days is going to be a lot different than when you get them up on feed. And we typically start those cattle at 1.7% of their body weight and pretty rapidly move up from there till day 30. But I would say after that, we always kind of say a half a pound of dry matter every 3 days. And when you move rations, so when you jump mega cows and energy, keep them at the same dry matter intake. So never increase their dry matter intake and increase their calories on the same day. That will help you immensely. And then, once they're kind of up on feed, look in that half a pound of dry matter intake every 3 days. And what I tell people is, if you're doing a really good job of bunk managing, if you're feeding twice a day, you want that bunk empty around 4 to 6 hours before you go to feed. If you're feeding once a day, you're going to want it empty about 8 to 10 hours, somewhere in there. And so just pick a time to read your bunk, do it consistently, make sure you're there. And some farms have 2 eyes. Sometimes it's good to have 2 eyes. Some guys have one guy that strictly does the bunk management. But we have different tools. The predicted intake sheet is by no means the Bible of, it's a guide, but it's going to help you make the right steps. We also have a bunk manager that we can put on your computer that shows you the last 7 days of dry matter intake and helps you make your feed call. So that's an option as well. And I was going to say this earlier, but so many young faces. I've got guys that have, smartphones that I get their feed records for the month, and it's, they've never written anything with a pen or a pencil. It's all on the smartphone and comes directly to me. So, that's an option as well.
Anybody have some more questions? I guess one is, Brian, what do you think is the biggest benefit Big Gain provides you as a producer?
Well, I think the tracking and the projections, just all the paperwork. We've got, as a producer, there's just, so many ways we're being asked to manage our finances, manage our EPA, DNR records. The list just goes on, and having a resource like Big Gain to provide you kind of some benchmarks, I guess I'd say, some starting points. I know some producers use it religiously and some producers use it as a checkpoint, but that's been a real resource. And then I think the biggest thing is the people involved. Kelly's got a couple counterparts that we've dealt with too, and they're all just as good and useful, and they have the information, and they're the kind of, if they don't have the information, they find it, and they let you know what it is, as far as nutrition or any other questions you might have. So I think that's just a great resource. They talked about building a team, and they've made it really easy to build a team with it, and including them in it, because they're reliable in that respect.
Got another question back here.
What is the best either software program or record-keeping program that you have found, whether that is Big Gain, I suppose that's what you're paid to say today, but any program to keep records for inputs and vet expenses and all that stuff, yardage, all that?
So as a company, we built our own. It's a series of Excel spreadsheets is what we use. And it's, pretty darn easy to use, pretty user-friendly. We're basically doing most of it for our customers. So they're sending in their records for the month, and then we're shooting the reports back. It's a 6-page report that you would get back on the pen of cattle, including current break-even, projected weight, all those types of things. I personally don't have a lot of experience with other software. I do have some customers that have become customers of mine that have used other ones. And I will say that Dan O'Connor, who was one of the guys that hired me to come on, got his master's at University of Minnesota and went to work in the Continental Grain Feedlot Managers program at Delhart. He's the one that built that program, and he grew up on a 1,200 head feed yard in southwest Minnesota, been involved in it all of his life. So instead of some software engineer putting together some record-keeping program, it's got every penny that you would spend, and it's really farm-friendly. And so instead of spitting out a bunch of numbers that maybe don't quite mean so much, I guess it's got the data there that you need. I don't know if you have any experience with any other ones.
Something I've used a little bit, the University of Wisconsin has a couple tools, and they're Excel-based too. But I've used those, and I've kind of used those in combination with, and sometimes I've plugged some numbers in there and got that tuned in pretty close. So instead of bothering Kelly all the time, I can just plug some numbers in those and kind of get by with that. So if you want a cheap or an inexpensive way, I'd look at University of Wisconsin. That's the way to do it. But nothing beats too is having somebody to explain what the numbers mean after you see them, because there's a lot of numbers that mean nothing if you don't understand how they were created. So,
Other questions from the group?
Where do you see DNA coming into the equation of how you buy and feed cattle? SOEDIS and some of those that are out there pushing pretty hard.
yeah, I think probably the key is when you can buy in numbers. When you're still buying, 2 or 3 guys cattle to fill a yard. DNA might have, it obviously, we know it has an impact, but using that too heavily until we can get maybe a genetic base that's large enough. Some of the seed stock producers, still, kind of building off of your idea that, influence sales. If you can kind of start to do that with DNA and source a large group of cattle, so you can have a whole group, whole pen, it would make sense. I mean, just use Holsteins as an example. That's not typecast quite as precisely as probably what you're talking about, but that group as a breed is as tight as it's going to get. Well, it's pretty easy to see consistency when they're fed right, going that route. So I think it's going to grow, but it's just getting that volume there to make it worthwhile.
Kind of a long question, but as a young producer, I think a lot of us here dream about building a monoslope slatted barn, and then maybe a hoop barn is our next dream. When in reality, as a young, small producer, none of us are going to be able to afford that to build it and fill it with our own cattle. I mean, what's the best? I mean, with EPA, DNR, where obviously you have to do some things, but, putting a couple bunks out in the cornfield and feeding 50 head of cattle made a lot of people money. Is that even possible anymore? I mean, what's your guys' experience on what actually is going to cash flow for a smaller guy just getting started, or do you build the biggest thing you can build and custom feed cattle? A lot of questions there, but.
I thought about that a lot ever since Kelly asked me about being part of this discussion. It's a challenge in the EPA or the DNR or the environmental situation is probably the wild card in the whole thing. If we knew exactly where we were going, it'd be a lot easier to answer that question. And in my opinion, I think, and I asked Kelly this the other day just to make sure, when we were looking at building our buildings and we settled on the hoop barns, we went on, I think between my father-in-law and myself, we probably went on 2 or 3 trips with Big Game looking at different facilities. And then they were saying, if they're well-managed pens, with the bedding right and manure managed properly and bunks managed properly, there really isn't a huge difference or a significant difference in feed conversion average daily gain. So an open lot's just as good as a big building if they're managed properly. I asked her that the other day, are they still seeing the same thing? And the answer was yes. So from that standpoint, I think anything's possible for a young producer to get started. I know a producer in western Iowa that is feeding a lot of cattle very successfully at open lots, and they've done it for years and continue to do so, and did some things to step up to meet the EPA regulations on that. I guess there's no one answer, to that situation. It's not what probably anybody ever wants to hear. They want somebody to help them out. But, I think a bedded barns are probably the best of both worlds, but it just still comes back to management on those because they're labor intensive to do it right. And then there's some expenses and some time consumed there that you wouldn't have anywhere else. But if you're a young guy just starting out and the cash is the issue, those cash flow a lot better, a lot easier, and you're doing some things for the environment, that's going to keep everybody else at their in satisfactory conditions.
So we've got several producers that have 3 types of facilities: outside yards, deep bedded facilities, and slatted confinement barns on the same farm, feed same types of cattle in there. And I'm going to answer that question or what Brian was talking about with management. Last winter when we got snow every 3 days and, it was colder than heck, obviously the management in that outside pen is going to be a heck of a lot different than in the slatted confinement building. And one of the things that I really try to talk with people about is looking at your labor and understanding, what the labor differences are. And a beautiful sunny summer day, obviously that big outside pen is going to be a lot different than in the winter. But to be 100% honest, my best managers outside who build facilities are my best managers inside. It takes different labor, but a lot of times our closeouts aren't that hugely different. Now, I've got guys that don't do a good job bedding outside, and they build a slatted confinement barn, and they do see improvement because the cattle were dirty and, we had issues outside. But that's a difference in management, in my opinion. Maybe not necessarily, I guess if they did a better job outside, it probably would bring that a lot closer. To answer your question a little bit, I think, sit down and, plan some futures. I guess one thing, sometimes people get a little bit ahead of themselves in saying, I'm going to build a facility before they really understand where the cattle are going to come from. And so that's probably the one thing I would recommend is try to get an understanding of what you're going to put in whatever facility you build and what the long-term sustainability of procuring those cattle and, what your marketing options are going to be and get that all in place. I worked with one gentleman who wanted to increase his size, and one of the things that we did was we actually worked into a flow where we were getting more calves. He's a Holstein feeder. We were getting more calves early before the building was even built, putting them in a custom yard, because then all of a sudden with the bank, we had the cattle numbers, and then, then the building came later, but we had the cattle to fill it. And the occupancy rate was there. And I wasn't kidding when I said you sit down and start running occupancy rate differences on buildings and what that really means to your bottom line. And so as a young guy, I would say figure out what kind of cattle you want to put in there, figure out where they're going to come from, and then start looking at what kind of facility to build.
We're getting close to the end of our time here. I think we've got time for one more question. Ted?
Yes. Kelly and Brian, the projection you handed out, 225-day feeding period, $20 profit per head. As a young producer, what would you tell them to put those cattle in or pass on them? And on the other side of that, if say that was $150 a head, would you recommend that they take their chances that that'll be there when they finish them, or go ahead and do some hedging on those cattle?
So I didn't get that chance because I got the cattle are here. This is what I paid for, run the projection. Obviously we talked this morning about return on investment, and you look at what the return on investment is on the bottom of that projection. It's the very bottom number. It's obviously not super impressive. And so I probably, one of the mistakes, we talked about mistakes this morning, one of the things that I was going to say is sometimes I'm not aggressive enough for some of my customers because I've probably told more guys to pass on a group of cattle than I have make to kind of push a projection and make them buy the cattle and it not work out. And I think that's a little bit just my nature. I'm just a little bit more conservative. And so I would probably, had he asked me that at the time, I would probably say just where the market has gone. I don't know. It probably depends on the producer and their financial standing. But that's getting down to where that return on investment is probably not as, looks probably not as good as where I'd like to see it. But I think helping them understand where you can find different groups of cattle to make that projection a little better is probably more important. Your question on if it was $150 a head, back to my conservative nature, I try to tell people all the time, a double or a triple is better than striking out all the time. It's not a home run, but it's better than striking out. And so, there are people that don't, we put cattle in and I'm saying, let's lock up a half or at least lock up a third, and they don't. And they make, this past year, they were brilliant. They made a lot of money. But from my standpoint, I'm a young farmer too. My husband and I are, we're getting started at this too. And so from my standpoint on a conservative side, I'm always trying to tell people to lock up some. So.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what Kelly said. When we got started, the first group we put into those hoop barns was a group of Holsteins through Big Gain. And we had the chance to lock them in. This was 08. We had the chance to lock them in, I think, for a whopping $1.15, I think, at one point, which, now people will say, well, that's nothing. But at the time, that was huge money when we didn't lock them in. Sold them for, I don't know, mid-90s or something. That was still great money at the time, but I did the calculations and figured it out, and had we locked them in, we would have paid for about 75% of the hoop barn in that first turn. So, yeah, I would be, if you could make over $100 a head, I'd be more inclined to lock it in. And then as far as a young guy starting out making $20, I think it gets back to resources again. I think it'd be a matter of what else could I be doing with my time and effort and energy at that point, and maybe my capital. But you got to realize that's one group, one turn of a building or a facility, too. But for that much profit, you might be, if you're a young guy starting out, you might be able to use that time and energy, honestly, at a job in town or something to supplement your farm income. So, it's just situational. But if that's 1 yard of 15 yards or 10 yards or 5 yards you have, it's a whole different situation. So.
All right, guys, lots of good questions today. Let's give Brian and Kelly a round of applause for their time today. Lots of challenges in getting started in livestock, from the EPA to prices to doing the small things right. So want to let you know that our next session is going to begin here at 1:35, just real shortly, back over in the big room. Appreciate you coming today.